Awesome. Cool. All cylinders go. So hello, I am Nell Derick Debevoise. I'm the founder and CEO of Inspiring Capital and a founding partner of the Purposeful Collective, which is putting on this Purpose for All campaign. And that is the context in which we're here with Chip Conley from both the Modern Elder Academy as well as a senior advisor at Airbnb. So hi, Chip.
Thank you. Great to be with you now.
Yeah, likewise. Likewise. Thanks for making time. More Zoom hours is not necessarily what anyone needs these days.
Not really, but that's okay. You know what? It's our only choice right now.
It's our only choice. So here we are. Here we are. So yeah, our work in this campaign is just all about this idea of making purpose more accessible, more democratized, maybe even more fun, and more action oriented. I think good news, bad news of this kind of peak purpose that we're living in the last 5 or 10 years is that it's gotten a little maybe diluted or increased skepticism, or maybe it's a millennial thing, or maybe it's a woman thing, or maybe it's a modern elder thing, or I don't know. What do you think about this whole purpose buzz that we're in?
There's a famous phrase that actually is attributed to a few different people, but it says the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away.
Right.
So from my perspective, purpose is different than meaning, and meaning is you get meaning by the sense that to use Mark Twain said there's 2 most important days in your life: the day you were born and the day you figured out why. And the figured out why is the meaning, and it's the sense of like, and sometimes people call that their purpose, and I'm open to it. That's how I've called it historically. Is if I were to say meaning and purpose, I'd say, well, my purpose is so strong that it gives me meaning. But actually, I think meaning is something you aspire to as well. So you aspire to meaning. The meaning of your life is to find your gift. The purpose of your life is to give it away. So the purpose is actually is about generativity. It's about actually, how is it that the thing that you do that feels so meaningful to you and maybe so intrinsic to your calling in life is something that in its purpose is meant to actually be given away. And that's where purpose, from my perspective on purpose, is a little bit different than others. And it's probably because I'm almost 60 years old and I am in a place in my life where, yeah, I think quite often about generativity. How am I giving back to other generations? What's the legacy? And I think it's also, this element of it moves beyond the sense of something that's so egocentric, because a purpose can, in some ways, the way it's framed often can feel so much about, the self-absorption around it for you, when in fact, I think a true purpose that actually has sustainability is one that is woven into a mission and a sense of collaboration that is way beyond you.
Yeah, beautiful. So back up a little bit, bring us up to current date with your story and your background to this work, through hospitality and then obviously the Airbnb work and leadership, but then your work done in Baja now too. Share a little bit of that track.
So I started a boutique hotel company at the very early stages of the boutique hotel movement in the United States. It was called Joie de Vivre. So the meaning or the purpose, the mission of the company was also our name. It's Joy of Life. And of course you'd know that because you have a French name, don't you? Is it French?
I know French for other reasons. It was generations ago. We've let go of the Frenchiness, but thank you. Yeah,
the Frenchiness. No more Frenchiness. Okay. So I ran that company, Joie de Vivre, for 24 years as the CEO, created 52 boutique hotels, very much on purpose. But the purpose often was my own ego. Purpose was, I love the innovation. I love the creativity. I love taking care of people, which is the hospitality business. But I really loved being an innovator and being perceived as an innovator. And then I sold the company. We were the second largest in the US. And during the Great Recession. So it wasn't exactly the best timing to sell, but it was just, I was done. And then a couple of years later, the 3 founders of Airbnb, when they were a small tech startup, asked me to help them turned their little tech startup that was very focused exclusively on budget millennial travel in major cities to becoming a mainstream hospitality brand and company. And I've done that for more than 7 years. I did it 4 years full time as the head of global hospitality and strategy and the in-house mentor to Brian Chesky. So part of my purpose then was giving away entrepreneurship, leadership, emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
a lot of things that I learned along the way. And then I've now in this advisory role. And then while I was writing my last book, which is called Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder, I was down here in Baja at my home on the beach, and I went for a run on the beach, and I just had this epiphany one day, and I said, why is it that people don't have schools and tools in midlife to help them with their purpose and their sense of wellness and their sense of community, which is an idea that comes out of the Stanford's Distinguished Careers Institute, where they've been able to show that one of the things that distinguishes people who are healthy or unhealthy in retirement or in the latter part of their life is whether they have a sense of purpose. Do they have a sense of community, and do they have a sense of wellness? Yeah. And the purpose and community are quite obvious, that people sometimes lose that when they retire. But wellness is less clear, and the reason people lose the wellness when they maybe retire is because of the fact they lose the structure and discipline that work provides. So long story short is we created the MEA, Modern Elder Academy, and we've now had over almost 800 alums go through the program from 24 countries, and it's the world's first midlife wisdom school, dedicated to not just lifelong learning, but long life learning. How do you learn what it means to create a long life and a beautiful one? Yeah. So it's been great. And so I've had a lot of purposes in my life. I've had a lot of callings. This purpose right now feels the most meaningful of anything I've done, partly because it's a social enterprise as opposed to a for-profit enterprise. Not to say that Airbnb and Joie de Vivre didn't have strong social missions, they did. But in this case, I don't pay myself anything. I've built 4.5-acre campus. 62% of the people who've gone through the program have been on some form of scholarship. So we're very dedicated to socioeconomic diversity. Our basic premise is that wisdom is not taught, it's shared. And so how do you bring together a collection of people who have quite different backgrounds to share their wisdom with each other for a week?
Yeah, that's such an interesting distinction. That's my world of, B Corp. And so it's, that difference to me is interesting when you say social enterprise versus a more traditional for-profit. What's the line there? How do you distinguish?
It's a good question. I think, we're not a B Corp, although we could be one. It's certainly something we've considered, actually. I'd say a social enterprise / B Corp is focused on multiple stakeholders in fundamental ways that they hold themselves accountable to. Yep. And a B Corp, the rules of B Corps help the accountability, but you can do it without B Corp too if you are just determining what are the ways you want to hold yourself accountable, and how do you measure that, and what do you do in the world to sort of help become a role model for others. And that's really what we're doing. And it's been beautiful, partly because I had 5 friends commit suicide, all 42 to 52, all men, during the Great Recession and during a 2.5-year period. And what I knew back then, and now I am putting into practice today, is this sense that sometimes people hit midlife, and I used to define midlife as 45 to 65, but now I define it as 35 to 75 because I'll tell you, I can say that later. But long story short is you hit 35 to 75 and sometimes you get a little lost. You feel irrelevant, and there aren't a whole lot of schools and tools to support people through the transitions that happen quite plentifully in midlife. And so I feel the strong sense of purpose of giving it back in this mission.
Yeah. So many directions to go, but I know our time is not infinite, so I'll try to stay a little bit on our narrative. So you've alluded to this and said that there have been many. I think the nuance of meaning, purpose, calling is so rich. I mean, just there, you could spend, I don't know, a week retreat probably trying to unwind those. But if I asked you your purpose in this moment, how would you describe it?
To make aging aspirational again.
Mhm.
I'd say
That's beautiful.
that's one way to put it. It's also another way to put it is to inspire and empower people through their midlife transitions.
Mhm.
Um, those are slightly different in terms of their intent, but they both have a similar perspective, which is to help people to understand the life stages of what happens in midlife and beyond, and help them to see that life is not just this everything's going fine, you hit midlife, you have a crisis, and then what you have to look forward to on the other side of the crisis is disease and decrepitude. And when in fact there's something called the U curve of happiness, which actually has proven that people do hit not a crisis necessarily, although your mileage may vary, but you hit a low point often between 45 and 52. And then frankly, with each passing decade after that, you get happier and happier. And the data is really clear. Social science has proven this across all cultures around the world. And so there's an interesting, now it's hard though. It's really like, wait a minute. We live in an ageist culture. Why would people be happier in their 70s than their 60s, than their 50s, than their 40s? And there's a lot of reasons for it. But what I'll say is so much of it has to do with getting comfortable in your own skin just when it starts to sag. And also having a sense that the first half of your life is about accumulating and the second half of your life is about editing. And when you go into the great midlife edit, which is something we talk about down here at the Modern Elder Academy and something we help people do, you actually feel so freed up from the mindsets, the identities, the responsibilities and the ways of being that have maybe served you up to a point, but are no longer serving you. It was Carl Jung, the psychologist, who said that you have a primary operating system the first half of your life, which is your ego, and it's around midlife that the primary operating system starts to shift to your soul. What I believe is that for many of us, we don't even know that primary operating system change is happening. And it's circumstantial stuff. It's COVID, it's a divorce, it's a parents passing away, it's losing a job and feeling purposeless. There's elements that are the indicators that you are actually supposed to go through a major shift. And yet there's very little in the way of rites of passage, ritual, or education or learning that help people through that. And especially for men, there's very little social role models around men being vulnerable with each other about this. Women are so much better at that. And this is probably the reason the male suicide rate is so much higher than the female suicide rate. One of many reasons. So that's what's going on.
Worthy purpose.
Yeah.
What about, I mean, you talked about the accessibility of your programs, but I think, obviously the demographic shift in this is so real, right? The Linda Gratton's work on the 100-year life, and it's just a whole new ball game now when midlife is either literally midlife at 50, that you have a whole 50 more to go, right? That's a
right.
ball game. And especially in the United States, that's very unevenly distributed, right? The Times whole section this weekend on how our cities are failing, that Chicago, I think, is one of the most stark examples, that within, is it 2 miles or something, right? From Lincoln Park to whatever other areas, 30-year gap in life expectancy, depending on where you're born, right? What are we going to do about that? I mean,
well, it's a really good question. And the question also is across countries, cultures.
right.
And what's interesting is the US is falling behind. For the US is seeing a plateauing of its longevity in the last 3 years. And whereas there's a lot of other countries, there's countries that I'm not going to go off on a tangent and say the countries because I can't remember them, but there's countries that you consider a developing country, like I'm going to use Vietnam. Vietnam, I think is behind us. So the longevity is younger than it is here. But a country like Vietnam that you wouldn't necessarily think has more longevity than we do, has more longevity. There's a lot of developing world countries that are like that. And there's so many reasons for that. And then there's also, as you just the example of being in Chicago. So much of it is cultural and nurture, not nature. It's how the culture influences how we behave. It's how the politics and the government actually is, providing services or education, equally in ways that people have the access to them. And the less access or the less education around certain elements of wellness, the more the disparity we see in outcomes. So what do we do about it? It's a really good question. We're seeing it in COVID right now with a lot of the people who are most vulnerable are people who actually were obese, had diabetes, they had some underlying conditions that actually made them even more vulnerable. And often those people were in communities where they were less educated, less affluent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or they're in nursing homes, not by their choice necessarily,
Right.
purely because it was the only option of where they could be. And then, their nursing home got virtually wiped out. So there's a lot here. It's, the one thing I will say that is interesting about nursing homes as a subject is the average age in 1960 of someone going into a nursing home was age 65, interestingly. The average age today is almost 85.
Yeah.
And so it's a completely different era. And what this speaks to is the following, is we've added some life in the last 60 years in the US. We had a lot of life in the last 120 years in the US. But a lot of the life we've added is in this modern elder period, this period of latter midlife, where people are, people say, 50, 70 is the new 50. That's how people pose it. Well, what they mean by that often is like, okay, you're sometimes in the kind of health at age 70 that your parents might have been at age 50, because you learned that smoking wasn't a good thing and drinking too much wasn't a good thing, and you started doing yoga and mindfulness, and you aren't eating meat all the time or at all. And there's elements that's like, okay, that is true. And then there's other elements in the population where it's like, oh, this is so not true. And that disparity is one that I think public health officials have not solved yet, because I think at the end of the day, it actually has to be solved with the government and with the will of the people. The will of the people has to say, yeah, we feel like healthcare and health education are fundamental rights that people have to have. But I'm not going to get too political on that. I'm just going to say that I think the more a country has helped educate their people about wellness, the more likely there'll be less disparity.
Right. Yep. We'll put a bookmark in that one for now. But so as well as the modern elder work, congratulations on having been an early mentor for Brian Chesky, because I think we've all been so impressed in this incredibly difficult moment for a company that so many of us love. As a host and a traveler and a fan and experience user, I think Airbnb is just a brilliant thing, and wish it well in whatever this next era of travel looks like, right? But the post that you shared that I've seen going around a bunch of how he laid off a quarter of the team, right? Which is brutal, but to do it with dignity and laptops and shares is night and day, right? So
and to create a portal, actually, it turned out when you include all the contractors as well who were laid off, it was 35% of the workforce. And Brian and I just talked about that this weekend. That doesn't get a lot of attention because they did it in two phases. The contractors about 3 weeks before the rest of the employees. But the company set up a portal for all the employees and said, listen, we have some of the smartest people on the planet and some of them don't have a job anymore. Here's how to find them. And like companies don't do that. I mean, that's like, what is that? So I'm proud. I mean, one of my purposes is to give back to younger CEOs and to help them to see how to accelerate and cultivate their own wisdom in a way that allows them to be smarter leaders more quickly. Because here's the fact, we're living longer, but power is moving younger and the world is changing faster. So I was mentoring Brian, but he was also my boss. So he was 21 years younger than me. So the whole premise of having a younger boss, 40% of the US has a younger boss by the year 2025, more than half of the US population will have a younger boss.
Wow.
So what we need to do, I think from my perspective as a purpose is help younger leaders microwave their emotional intelligence, their leadership skills, their strategic thinking in such holistic kind of connecting the dots kind of ways that it allows them to be more successful more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, Brian and his co-founders started the company at age 26 and 24. And so I started my company when I was 26, but my company was just a bricks and mortar company. So it was never going to grow as quickly as Airbnb did.
Right.
So yeah, that's a part of my purpose, is that sense of knowing there's a new generation. And part of the thing that I'm a boomer, part of the thing that a lot of boomers think is like, oh, damn those millennials, they don't really want, mentorship or help. And yeah, if you come at them and say, this is how the world works, you'll get an okay boomer. But instead, if you come at them with a real curiosity and an empathy, 75% of millennials would like to have a mentor, and yet only 2% have one. So there's a huge gap.
Totally. I think I always blame that a little bit on us. I think, because knowledge or because information is right here, right? I think that there is a carriage or an outward attitude of younger folks, I mean, millennials who are, again, in their mid-30s at this point, who, that they can find out anything, right? And so there's a certain confidence that comes with that. But you can't Google knowledge, right? And if you look at anxiety rates,
I think you can Google knowledge. You can't Google wisdom.
Right, fair.
You probably can do Google knowledge.
Fair.
Can you Google insight? Harder. Wisdom, even harder. So it's almost like a pyramid. At the base is like data, and then there's knowledge, or data, information, knowledge, insight, wisdom. And as you go up that pyramid, it's less likely you're going to find it on Google. It's a funny thing Pablo Picasso said. Computers are useless. They only give you answers. And so in many ways, a great mentor, or a modern elder, as Brian used to call me, or still calls me, is someone who is catalytic in their questions. So it's similar to Socrates long ago in Greek times. It's like Socrates was the one who was walking around town asking the young, Greeks interesting questions, the Socratic method.
Totally. And so what does a microwave for wisdom and leadership look like? What a great metaphor. As an Xer, I love the microwave.
Hopefully it doesn't explode. What it means is, I'm going to use an example, because we can talk in generalities, but if you get into examples, it's really helpful. Yeah. So what I tend to ask the people I help to mentor who are usually 15 to 30 years younger than me, sometimes 35 years younger, is the following. It's like, okay, what are the 5 adjectives you would like people to use to describe your leadership style and how you show up? In other words, what's your reputation? What 5 adjectives? And let's figure out what those are. And then we'll talk through them, and they'll tell me, okay, well, these are aspirational. And then I say, okay, tell me the 5 you think people would actually use to describe you now. And then we look at those. And then we say, okay, it's now time to go out and do an anonymous survey of the 12 people closest to you who work with you. Some are direct reports, some are people who maybe, who knows? Some of them are often maybe investors even, if you're an entrepreneur. And let's see what 5 adjectives are most common amongst that group. And then we compare the 3. And there's a big difference between aspirational, then what they self-identify, which is usually somewhere in between, and then often like what's over here that other people come up with. And then I say, now our job in the next 6 months is for us to look at what are the behaviors you could exhibit, or actual new habits you could start to demonstrate that would be relevant to these 5 aspirational adjectives. And then let's 3 months and 6 months from now, go back to these same people and see what 5 adjectives they'd come up with each, and see what's most common. And so that's a process, and it's a beautiful process, because actually it more than anything, it wakes that young leader up to saying, wow, I'm so focused on my company brand, but I'm not very focused on my personal reputation. And a company brand and a personal reputation are frankly the same thing.
Mm.
And so you can do that same exercise I just described with your company brand as well. And so, yeah, I mean, if someone said inspiring, I know that's a word that means something to you, then I would say to them, okay, you know, no one said it's inspiring. We had 12 people. They came up with a total of 47 different adjectives with some commonalities. Not one of them said inspiring. So I go back to that CEO or leader, it could be a mid-level leader, and say, so what are ways that you would show up that would actually build a reputation for being inspiring? And then we'll talk that through. And then I'll say, well, when was the last time you did something like that? So for example, what would be an inspiring? Well, actually, let me ask you, Nell, what do you think would be a way, since you're an expert on inspiring, what would be a way that a leader would show the reputation for being inspiring?
Yeah, I think so much of it is modeling, right? And so whether that's having and then being transparent and vocal about a meditation or mindfulness practice or boundaries around work-life balance, you know, and anything like that is really important, I think.
So inspiring is almost another way of saying, you know, a real role model, you know, so a role model for something beyond just, you know, business or just your career.
Yeah.
So there's an element of, and you help that person see, okay, wow, I've never really seen myself that way. If I really want to be inspiring, okay, maybe I'll come up with a different adjective. No. Sometimes they do say that. Sometimes say like, okay, I'm gonna
give up on that one.
I want to come up with some easier adjectives, less aspirational.
Nice.
Fine. Nice. I don't like nice, unique, interesting, or any ubiquitous words. Inspiring's good enough. But yeah, I mean, and I could do that exercise for myself if I wanted to. And you can adapt it over time as our own aspirations of what our reputation is would change. So my aspirations or my adjectives today would be different than they were 30 years ago.
Sure. And so this gets to, you know, the kind of moment we're in now of COVID and what about this human to human business? Why did we lose that? And do we get it back now? And is this part of the path to it? I mean, you know, it sounds like basic kind of self-awareness and then really coaching, right, is the secret. How do we get back to that more human way of being and doing through this?
There's so many ways I could answer that, and I think they all risk it being somewhat generalizations. But let me just say that I think one of the challenges in modern life is the transactional nature of it. And when we move into a transactional nature in our work, we tend to be focused on the short term. We tend to be focused on our own needs. And it's a bartering or an exchange that is based upon both parties feeling good about it. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. The challenge with that is when your life is the life of a merchant and you're just being a mercenary merchant, the natural tendency is for people to not take into account the emotional and contagious effect of how they show up. You know, I've said for a long time, leaders are the emotional thermostats of those they lead, which basically means that you're not the thermometer, which sort of just tells us the temperature. You're the one who actually affects the climate control. And once you start to realize that, it helps you to show up a little differently, and maybe in a way where you're a little bit more human. And my blog post on Wisdom Well, which is my daily blog, Wisdom Well, it was really about that today. Quite simply, you know, we are, at the end of the day, the qualities that people most appreciate and the role models that we are often not so much focused on efficiency or being a mercenary or transactional. They tend to focus on the human qualities. And the human qualities could be courageous and resilient. It doesn't have to be all soft. And, you know, a lot of men sort of have a hard time with this. It's like, you know, that's all the soft stuff. And, you know, it is the soft stuff, but it's also the successful stuff in the sense that Daniel Goleman's work showed around emotional intelligence showed that 2/3 of the success of leaders came from their EQ, while only 1/3 came from the combination of their IQ and the level of experience they had in their work. So EQ is not just a good thing and makes people feel good. It's actually a success quality for effectiveness, for effective leadership.
Yeah. So closing question, what's your hope as we build back better? You know, what's your hope to come out of this? I mean, I don't know. I just get heebie-jeebies all up my back when they talk about rushing back to normal. You know, it's like there's this divide between the
That's
realization that
the
normal is
new
what got us
abnormal.
here.
Yeah, that's why I call it the new abnormal. And I don't think abnormal is
Yeah.
a bad thing. I think abnormal is basically saying that the normal wasn't necessarily a good normal. It's a really hard, all these are hard questions to answer because it's, at the end of the day, what I can say is the change that we're going to see in the world is not going to happen unless it starts with yourself personally. And that's such a cliche. You know, Rumi, Gandhi, a bunch of people have said something like that. So I'm just ripping people off. But what does that mean? It just really means that the questions I would ask myself is, you know, if I knew I only had 5 years left to live, how would I live at them? I mean, I don't love the 1 year left or 1 month left because that's not very practical. But let's say you had only 5 years left to live. You know, how would you change? You know, has this experience taught you something about your status quo? Do you want to live differently? One of the positives of this is that this may have given people a little more freedom to work remotely. Now, what I don't mean there is like, okay, we're all everybody's in their boring bedroom doing their thing, you know, projecting themselves to everybody else. No, it means that literally you might be able to have the freedom to get rid of your home or your apartment, live like a digital nomad. A digital nomad as a trend has been a big trend. Airbnb has really been helped by it over the last 5 to 10 years, but it's been mostly a millennial trend. I think the idea of the digital nomad, the person who can work from the road and thinks of wherever they're at as not a home away from home, but a home instead of home, is allows people to potentially, in a world where people start traveling again, allows people to go and live in places that would have been a dream, would have been a place you go for vacation, but not to work. And so I think that's a real positive. And I think that's one that more people are going to consider is how do I have more freedom in terms of where I can live? But yes, spaciousness is going to be important because, you know, generally people got some spacious, but let's also recognize, God, so many people have been laid off, you know, in my industry, hospitality and travel. It's terrible. And you know, the Fed Reserve Chair has shown that 40% of people who are making $40,000 or less, 40% of people making $40,000 or less a year in the United States lost their job in March. What? That's crazy. And so we have to be really thoughtful about the fact that there's a structural change that's probably going to come out of this. I just don't know what it's going to be yet. But there's a structural change that's going to come out of this because we're in the second inning of a 9-inning baseball game. Yeah. When we really factor in the economic implications of where things are going. Yeah. So on that happy news, we're done.
Good luck, everybody. No, that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's plenty of positivity throughout. So that's good. No, I really appreciate it though. Great insights and great work, Chip.
Yeah. Thank you, Nell. Great to see you. And I hope people enjoy our time together.
Yes, same. Thanks so much for it. Cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.